I'm thrilled to be here and thrilled to talk about this. I'd like to start with a special thank you to my colleagues at the Global Implementation Society and the National Implementation Research Network for sharing training, models, and materials that I'm using today. Well, before I move forward, in full disclosure, I am actually an active member of the GIS. I went to the last conference, the Global Implementation Society conference. It was in Scotland, fortunately, and realized I had really found my people, so to speak, and I have become increasingly more engaged. It's a great group, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it later. Great resources. I'd also like to take this time to highlight that while I have been working in criminal and juvenile justice intervention and evaluation for decades, comparatively, I'm a newbie to the field of implementation science. It's only been a few years, and what I present today is not really meant to be an exhaustive presentation on implementation science. One could easily spend 60 minutes or this webinar period or more on any one of the frameworks I will present a little later. Rather, I hope to share some key concepts and how I was able to utilize them while implementing a program evaluation process model for the SPEP over the past 12 years. In terms of objectives for today, I'd like to start with a definition of implementation science. And I know we all probably have a definition, everyone on a call, but just to center everyone and make sure we're all on the same page, we'll start with that. Then I'm going to move to, and I'm going to just do a brief, but hopefully useful description of our innovation, what we are implementing, and what I've been implementing with Mark Lipsey for many years now, called the Standardized Program Evaluation Protocol, or the SPEP, or SPEP, some of our sites call it, and Mark, I believe, called it SPEP. Then I'd like to take this information and show you some implementation science tools that I have found incredibly useful in the implementation process, and I'm going to use my implementation experience with SPEP as an example. I'm going to end with giving you guys some useful resources that I unfortunately didn't know about it when I started this implementation adventure, but that you certainly will be armed with if you move in that direction yourself. Okay, so before we get to the sciencey part, in terms of implementation science, let's just focus on implementation, just that term alone. We've got usually some sort of problem out there that we're trying to solve, or at least deal with in some productive manner. And for us, and certainly for myself, it's generally the problem of crime and delinquency. And so what happens, you know, in a perfect universe, we've got this problem of crime and delinquency, and then somebody comes up with an idea about how to deal with, how to solve, or at least mitigate this problem. And I put that little book and glasses in there because as a researcher, I hope that the idea is somewhat or fully research-based, and time and effort has been put into finding out what has the most research evidence behind it. But regardless of whether they do that or not, we usually end up seeing programs, new programs, old programs being recycled, but some sort of actionable solution. And that's often to put an intervention program in place. Again, I said earlier, just a moment ago, it could be something that already exists, that's listed in crime solutions or blueprints, right? Or a variation on those programs. We also see a lot of totally new homegrown programs. Mark and I have found through the years that about 90+% of what kids are receiving today in terms of juvenile justice involved youth programs for intervention and recidivism reduction are homegrown. They are not what we would refer to as a blueprint brand name. So there's a lot of those homegrown ones out there. And then, so what else do we have up here? We've got the problem, we've got the idea, then we've got the, oh, let's solve it with a program. And then there's the next issue of, you know, outcomes. The idea here with our work, with my work, certainly is that mostly these outcomes look like recidivism reduction, or they look like an increase in some sort of pro-social domain. But looking at this lovely little lineup of crime, of problem, idea, program, and outcome, in terms of implementation, again, going back to that key word, where does that fit? Where does implementation come into play in this little scenario I've set up here? And what happens, I find a lot of folks think of implementation as an event, and I know I certainly did when I started this process. But in fact, it isn't. It really feels all the idea of implementation, the activities related to implementation, fill all the empty spaces on the screen, essentially. So I added that arrow between idea and program. That's typically where we see and think about implementation in terms of how do we get from idea to action, what's the funding going to look like, what's the training going to look like, those kinds of things. Where are we going to hold the program? Is there enough space? But additionally, we've got some arrows down at the other end too. Those are all implementation concepts. The idea here of if we get the program in place, yay, we've got to be collecting data to get to these outcomes. And not only collecting data to get to the outcomes, but hopefully, if you're doing it right, putting in data in and feeding it back so that the program can improve, and or you can have some sort of overall quality assessment or improvement process set up that occurs on a consistent basis. And finally, actually not quite finally, but the other area where people don't recognize implementation, but it really fits, there's some great tools out there, is the aspect of determining just what program is best. What is the change model that we're working from or want to work from? What's the best fit for this organization at this time? So the arrow goes there between the problem and the idea. Plus here, let's not forget all the external impacts, right? That are directly and indirectly related to implementation. Funding sources, which is the bane of many of our existence, legislation, the very structure of the juvenile justice system itself. Do you have a dispositional matrix? How's that going to fit in terms of program referrals? Risk assessments, needs assessments, or lack thereof. All these things have really huge impacts on implementation across the board. All right. So to get you in the right mindset here, I think we're now thinking about implementation and we're thinking about it in kind of a wider net than sometimes we approach it. To get you in the right mindset here, I'd like you to think about a program or innovation as a kid's play set. You can see on the screen there, this is a lovely little thing with a slide. It looks happy. There's a palm tree. The kiddos climb up one side and they slide down the other side. It looks great. It looks really, really effective, right, for kid fun. But what happens when we don't pay attention to the larger picture, to the other levels of implementation, to the other levels of the system? Programs and implementation, for that matter, don't happen in a vacuum. The best and most researched programs in the world, right, will not reduce recidivism or increase any of our pro-social variables that we want to see an increase in if it's not properly supported and intentionally structured and sustained. Okay? So keeping that in mind, moving to implementation as defined by Fixon, Blaze, and Van Dyke, as they put it, if innovations are not used as intended, they cannot produce intended results. It's a very simple statement, but wow, it says a lot. The science of, for example, the science of evidence-based programs, which I have been involved with my entire career. It's been developing and flourishing certainly since the 80s and 90s, due in great part to my colleague and former mentor, I guess still mentor, now colleague, Mark Lipsey. But how to implement and scale these evidence-based programs with fidelity and good social guarantees of good social positive outcomes has really lacked, right? And this is where the science of implementation comes into play. The idea here is to bridge the gap between research and practice. Interventions and innovations that appear to reduce recidivism in research on demonstration programs, for example, should also be able to have the same impact in real-world settings. And implementation science helps us with this. So to give you a definition to work with, I'm going to define, for purposes of this presentation and really my work in general, define implementation science again with Fixon et al. As a specified set of activities designed to put into practice an activity or program of known dimensions. Okay, unless we forget our aforementioned place set issue, I want to add in the idea that here that implementation is synonymous with coordinated change at system, organization, program, and practice levels. We must understand, anticipate, and act on the context the program is delivered in, and do so intentionally based on evidence to date. So while the field of implementation science has existed for a while, its utilization in both research and practice sectors has expanded rapidly over the past 2 decades. Lots of fields, K through 12 education, child welfare, have already greatly benefited from the disciplines of active implementation frameworks, guiding program implementation, increasing fidelity, enabling target contexts of innovation to produce outcomes that are socially significant. The principles of IS can also translate easily, and I'm going to show you this a little later in the presentation, beautifully translate to bring robust evidence, strategies, models, experience, lots of experience, to many practice and or program innovations developed for juvenile justice youth, okay? So a cornerstone monograph for implementation science that is amazingly useful for folks who are at any point in implementation or just thinking about it is the Implementation Research Synthesis of Literature, published in '05 by Dean Fixon, Sandra Now, Karen Blaze, Robert Friedman, Francis Wallace. The authors here present an exhaustive review from implementation specialists and researchers in all areas of program innovations and policy innovations around the world. It's synthesized, and they synthesized this info. They brought us really useful conceptual frameworks and common lexicons to use, and the common lexicon is especially key because these concepts and frameworks can and are used across the globe. The monograph or this document really describes the state of science of implementation and highlights, develops what is needed to transmit programs and practices, all kinds of programs and practices sustainably and with fidelity in the real world. So that said, taking the findings and from the synthesis, the Fixon et al. Synthesis, regardless of context, and I mean that sincerely. We're talking innovations like birth control in Nigeria, domestic violence screening in ERs in Canada, anger management programs in youth development centers in the States. But regardless of the context here, there are certain things that held together. So, and showed us where we can get positive pro-social outcomes. They tended to result when the following things were present. Practitioners need to receive training and coaching and performance assessments. We tend to have better implementation when there's infrastructure for training with supervision and coaching, as well as evaluation. Consumers and recipients are involved in the program selection and evaluation. We've been doing that increasingly with SPEP, and I cannot tell you how important and useful that has been. Funding streams, policies, regulations to create a hospitable or supportive environment for implementation and practice. So taking all these, we also know that putting up, in terms of these results, a lot of the work that was done in 2005 when this volume was written, as well as the work that continues to be done in implementation science, is really mission-driven. They're really looking for good outcomes for kids and families and adults in a criminal context. And from the text, I just wanted to share with you guys the results of this literature review, and this is referring to that little implementation research text up there, picture up in the right-hand corner, that the synthesis confirms that systematic implementation of practices are essential to any national attempt to use the products of science, such as evidence-based programs, to improve the lives of its citizens. Consequently, concerted national effort to improve the science and practice of implementation must accompany support for the science of intervention. Now, Fixon and his colleagues were serious about this. And I'm happy now to be one of these people in the mix. There's been a huge amount of research and work that's been generated in the past 15 years since this document was written to further this goal. So that brings us, now we've kind of set the table, what I mean about implementation and implementation science. What I'd like to highlight is our innovation. Mark Lipsey and my SPEP model, the Standardized Program Evaluation Protocol.
Gabrielle?
Yeah.
Gabrielle, this is Mark. Before you start on the SPEP model, I wanted to mention to the participants something I neglected to mention earlier. You may very well have questions for Gabrielle, and you can do that through the chat box. If it's not currently open, in the bottom right corner of your screen, look at the top of your screen and click on chat, and you have choices of the recipient. You can use all participants for public comments, or host, presenter, panelist for comments or questions for the host, presenter, or panelists. And I wanted to also remind you, if you have more than one person in the room participating in the webinar, use the chat box now to let us know that. You can ask questions throughout Gabrielle's presentation, but we will address them to her at the very end. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Gabrielle.
All right. Let's back to the SPEP, or our Standardized Program Evaluation Protocol. Sustainable performance improvement process for intervention services is really what we were looking to, and what Mark was initially looking to create. And what the SPEP does is it looks at services received by justice-involved youth with the intent on recidivism reduction, and compares them to what we know is research best practice for those particular interventions. I'll get back to that in a little bit. What SPEP does is it uses Mark Lipsey's meta-analytic database of over 700 experimental and quasi-experimental studies covering 1950 to 2014, and that's where we are currently. We need to do an update. And that is our evidence. That is what we use as our evidence base. I'm intimately related to and entangled with this database. I coded on it while I was in grad school, and even used the data set for my dissertation. Now it's the backbone of the programs and process I implement. It's been quite an adventure. Mark Lipsey started compiling the database in the 80s, then created the evidence-based scoring model in the early 2000s. He worked in 2 states where it was validated, and that's when I joined Mark. I came out of working in private industry and back with Mark as SPEP moved into its 3rd state, Tennessee, where I am now, and created the SPEP process. I also created all the implementation and training materials. So it was really the beginning of my adventure in implementation that has taken us to 14 states in the US and Australia so far. And what it's done is it's caused me to look beyond my regular lenses, my regular CRIM or program evaluation lens. I really found it hugely rich implementation science literature and tools that improved and directed my work by arming me with evidence-based tools and frameworks. So let's talk a little bit more about this SPEP. Essentially what SPEP looks like in practice is I will go into, or some of my trainers or master trainers will go into juvenile justice systems, figure out what the kids are getting in terms of intervention services, whether it be brand name, MST, FFT, ART, or more homegrown types of programs. And we do this in what we refer to as a classification process. And we match the services that the kids are actually getting to research. That's our metadatabase. And then at that point, we gather 3 additional related data points. The quality of that particular service we just identified, the quantity of service that the kid is actually receiving, where they're receiving it, as well as the risk level of each child receiving it. So to summarize, there's 4 key components, and they equate to what we know from our meta-analysis to be the key predictors of recidivism reduction. Again, programs and service type, that's that classification piece, quality of the service, quantity in terms of dose and duration, risk level of each of the kiddos who are experiencing a particular service. These data points come together in a scoring tool that's used to identify how a service is actually performing compared to what we know from research to be the best practice for that particular service, right? What we have in research, how you optimize that service, what's the best prediction you can get on average in terms of recidivism from that particular service, and let's look and to see how things are being done in situ in, say, a YDC that we're working with. How is that service being delivered compared to what we know would knock it out of the park in terms of recidivism reduction? Those pieces come together, all those data points, the program type, the quality, the quantity, the risk, all come together and lead to what we refer to as a SPEP score. And the SPEP score then leads to a performance improvement process that starts with a feedback report, and then the cycle starts again. It's not a one and done. SPEP is a continuous, or is designed to be a continuous program improvement process, and through read scores and through feedback. And I want to say and highlight this, I'll talk about it a little bit in a minute, this is all done within a context of what I refer to and what the SPEPers, yes it is a thing, refer to as the practice pillars of SPEP. That is partnership, education, and transparency. is the culture we try to bring to surround and embed this whole SPEP process. So with all of that, let me tell you a little bit about what building the SPEP implementation capacity looked like. This is all before I was acquainted, and I had acquainted myself with implementation science. I just want to be clear about that. It was a bit like riding a bike while still building it, which is, I find, a common sentiment in these spaces. That said, I think implementation science could have greatly saved me and our early sites. If anybody's on from them, I apologize. I know more now. From much of the pain and this kind of iterative, needlessly iterative development. And so now part of this presentation is my penance, I guess you could say, trying to do what I can to make sure that you don't have the same hard path. So just to give you, just to tell you a story about the implementation process and the building of the implementation process for SPEP. Just a quick little run through, right? So we've got SPEP. Mark had developed the SPEP score. When I came on board, we were developing in 2008 this continuous program or performance improvement that was based on the score. I then pretty quickly added an entire overall process to the SPEP, recognizing it wasn't just this one and done tool. That required my development of a logic model. It became pretty clear that when we started pulling all these pieces together and just to get at those 4 key components, those 4 data points that I mentioned earlier, program type, quality, quantity, risk, just pulling those all together for a single service or kiddo, it really touched on all the aspects of the juvenile justice system as it directly impacts each child. So we realized and started seeing that this was a larger, more comprehensive assessment tool than maybe we had envisioned from the get-go. And with that, some other things pop in or became necessity. Not just training of folks about how to do this stuff, but multi-level training, trainers, master trainers, and peer-to-peer types of training that I created, communities of learning that were created. And not just that, but then there's the training quality assurance, right, that comes along with that. Within that, I added a life cycle to aid in the continuous program or performance improvement. Added what came, I'll talk about this a little later, came to be an incredibly useful thing thanks to my foray into implementation science, is the idea of implementation teams. Developed those. Again, there was all within this culture of partnership, education, and transparency, the 3 pillars of SPEP, adding in also the quality assurance process, not of looking at the quality of the services that are being implemented and that are being reviewed, but quality assurance of SPEP itself became necessary to create all these pieces. And I tell you this lovely kind of story and show you this very ugly graphic for 2 reasons. First, to illustrate the organic expansion of the original thing, that SPEP score arrow that Mark created initially, and this has all been done in about over 12 years' time. But I also show it to highlight what I learned, that this is often the case, that whether you start implementing something or have this innovation that takes on its own life due to a need, maybe you started it as a pilot with some vague idea of scaling later on, it becomes incredibly intense and difficult when you're not planning the full path and recognizing the full implementation path with all its decision points and all its consequences. The World Health Organization has a phrase with regard to scaling up that what you have to do this right is beginning with the end in mind, is seeing this whole process as it rolls out having some ideas, having some discussions before it actually happens. So the innovation itself, in terms of SPEP, grew and evolved, while simultaneously its implementation grew and expanded, which is not, I advise, the best way to do things. And so at first what we were doing was all reactive. We knew we had a validated tool, but from there, where did we go? There were no straight lines in this implementation or scaling up, at least in the beginning. And so what I want to talk to you about in this next set of slides, are some tools that would have been of great use at our beginning, but they are firmly my go-tos and in my toolbox now in terms of my SPEP implementation work. So let me just share some tools with you. And I've picked 4 key frameworks that, to be honest, I find the most useful, but there are many, many more out there. These are all, again, based on common features that exist among many successfully implemented programs and practices. To date, actually, there are over 30 identified implementation frameworks, maybe more since I looked last. But to meet the scope of the webinar today, I chose to highlight just these 4 key frameworks, and they're often referred to as part of the active implementation framework. You might have heard that term. And they also have tools associated that can guide implementation, from picking an innovation to developing a continuous sustainable program improvement plan for the innovation once it's in place. So let's start with this first one, the usable innovations. In terms of usual innovations, it means what you think it means. An innovation really needs to be functional and appropriate, not just what's new and shiny, which is often difficult. I've certainly been and dealt with legislators that think that everyone needs a dog program, and it's cute, it's shiny, there's great photo ops, and I'm sure there are lovely programs. We don't have sufficient research to tell us for sure in terms of recidivism reduction. But is that really the way to pick a program? Something that sounds good or that's a good photo op? Certainly not. But I'll tell you, in my experience, and maybe I bet you this is true in some of yours, this is not always the case. There's a clear description of the program that is really needed. This seems really obvious. But I will tell you, in the years of doing SPEP work, we really need this idea of matching the service to the appropriate research, right? That's that program component that I talked to you a minute ago about with regard to the SPEP, in order to figure out what the kids are actually getting in situ, in the facility or in the community, and match that to the appropriate research. We really have to do some deep digging. We really need to know what's going on and what the kids are getting. And this has been a constant challenge. What we find are that most DJJ folks can name services or programs like as a laundry list. Most of the time in community settings, the residential settings are a little less clear because there's so much going on there. But what we don't get from any of these laundry lists is a clear, non-jargon filled description. This is especially the case with those homegrown programs, and as I mentioned earlier, that makes up more than 90% of what the kids are getting. And I often say that one person's social skills program is another person's life skills program, is another person's CBT program. We need to be really, really clear about the descriptions, not just what it sounds like the kids are getting or what the vague description is on paper, but what actually is experienced by the kids, because it's often unclear. And being cautious in this area will go a very long way. We need also to have clear essential functions that define the program and with operational definitions as well. Simply like the description I was just talking about, the clear description of the program issues. these are often lacking. Is there a manual? Is there a protocol? Do you have to follow the sessions in order? Or can you move and fudge a little bit around? What's the training frequency? Is there any give me room? What does completion mean of the service? What time frame and exposure is required or is recommended by the developer? This is a big issue when you've got kids going through short-term facilities. They're there for maybe 6 weeks max, but you're delivering a program that the developer is very clear, and the research says the child needs to get the full benefit. They need 16 weeks. So is that the right program for the space? Maybe. But you might also want to think about extending that service or continuing that service in the community or in the next placement. Also, finally, the practical performance assessment. Is there, quality assurance and monitoring and corrective action? The fact of the matter is, you get these things with high-end programs, excellent programs like functional family therapy or MST, right? But you don't get these with homegrown programs a lot of times. So all these aspects that I just talked about play a significant role in determining if a program can be scaled or replicated at other sites. And so often we see services of the same name and description on paper look very different in practice. And making very clear that you can look at these, take these points into consideration before you put something in place, before you spend money on it, and before you train folks in it. The next key framework or tool I'm going to talk about is implementation stages. It's a great framework, again, from NERN, the National Implementation Research Network. And with implementation stages, I want to remind everybody, you probably know this already, but I just need to say it, it's not a sprint here. This is more of a marathon in terms of implementation. Although it's often difficult for funders to understand that, but research shows us that implementing well-constructed, well-defined, well-researched types of programs or innovation can be expected to take 2 to 4 years. Tell that to the funder who says you've got 18 months to not only implement, but also give me some recidivism data on the back end in terms of outcomes. So again, it's a marathon. In practice, we don't get this ideal time span most of the time, but it should be done well and right, 2 to 4 years. The justice systems, or the juvenile justice systems, don't and can't actually change on a dime, right? They need intentional planned stages of change to fully support ways of working and all these new processes. So the idea of the implementation stages, I think, is very helpful. That said, while it's laid out in phases, I want to add that each stage of implementation, from exploration, installation, initial implementation, full implementation, does not cleanly end where the other begins. Right? Often stages overlap with activities related to one stage are still occurring when the activities for the next one have just started. So you do get some simultaneous action. But that said, it does lay things out in a step-by-step process that people can see from the beginning so we can set expectations. So starting with this first one, starting with exploration. NERN has created an excellent tool called the hexagon tool that's really useful. It breaks down, excuse me, I'm gonna do that, okay, there we go. It looks at implementation site and program indicators, and it kind of leads the users through the key factors to consider before anything is actually implemented. Again, thinking about the end when you begin. It can be used as a planning tool to guide selection, going back to what we were talking about with usable innovations. But it can also help evaluate programs and practices for use. I think it's very useful if you take this seriously and really spend the time on the tool, that it gives you an ability to get that ultimate right kids, right programs, right time scenario. So I'm just going to go through these and give you some examples here, talk very briefly. This idea of capacity in terms of site indicators. Capacity is, does the site even have the funding capacity? So funding, structural, cultural responsivity capacity, these are all issues to look at on the front end. And how long will they have this capacity is really always my second question. Oftentimes, especially in grant scenarios, we can get the funding for the year of implementation and maybe the year to get some outcomes, next year to get some outcomes, but then who's going to pay for the half a position that's running the program and still running the implementation or maintaining the data. So again, long term, not just capacity to implement, but I'd say here it's capacity to maintain, sustain, with an eye to that as well. The next one is, how does it fit with current initiatives? And I will tell you squarely that SPEP, we have had the strongest sustainability insights that already had reform climates and some sort of movement in place. What we did, and I highly recommend this, is that we were able to align SPEP with other innovations, and that sometimes even leverage those innovations or leverage SPEP so that we had more success and less challenges to implementation when it was part of a larger movement and not just one innovation all out there on its own. In terms of need, you're not reinventing the wheel here. Trying to avoid duplication. Part of what SPEP does, in what I think folks have liked about it, at least in our surveys, we find is that we do a decent amount of customization so that if you already have certain systems, certainly if you have data systems that can provide the data elements that we need for the SPEP score or the processes of the SPEP program evaluation, program implementation process. If you have those, let's work around them and incorporate them rather than create something new. Also, I take this need stuff pretty seriously. We are very intentional about messaging and are addressing the issues of why bother and what's the point before we ever set foot on a site. The idea here is that we establish that we recognize there is a need and we make sure that folks see that and acknowledge it before we start trying to tell them all our new ideas about SPEP and our SPEP culture and pillars. In terms of the program indicator side, there's the evidence piece. You know, SPEP is a validated tool. It has been since we started to scale. But, you know, we want to also be able to revalidate the tool, and we want the sites to be able to validate their use of it locally. And this has been a very large issue. How much fidelity data can they even have? Do they have recidivism data? This is always a big issue. And what is the recidivism data? Is it returned to the Youth Development Center, or is it actually arrest? Arrest is awfully rare. So what data do they actually have? How can we get that evidence? How can we maintain it and set them up for success in terms of maintaining their own evidence? And selfishly, we'd like the evidence on our own. I'd like to know more about my tool and how it works in different contexts. The next one being usability. It's a key issue for implementation for us in terms of the SPEP as well, because there is so much diversity among juvenile justice systems, right? We have customized, getting back to that customization piece, we customize a lot to fit in and embed SPEP in the juvenile justice system that we are working with. That said, how much customization is too much? And this is always a line and a point of discussion in implementation science meetings and conferences. You know, you need to know how much customization is necessary before you start. It could be a huge problem and absolutely not just stall implementation, but stop implementation. If indeed your loss of fidelity with too much customization, or the customization that's really required is so great that you're not really doing what you think you're doing in terms of assisting and meeting that need that I just talked about. And then the last one is the support. The idea here of usability, of supporting staff and data. Those are the domains that have led to implementation and sustainability challenges for us and SPEP in our sites. And it goes beyond capacity just to implement, but really capacity to sustain. In terms of the implementation, the next set of implementation stages, there is installation, there is initial implementation and full implementation. And I'm looking at time here. What I want to talk very briefly about in terms of installation is really what you're doing is you're kind of readying the field for implementation, looking at developing communication protocols and ensuring human and financial resources are in place. Part of doing this is to embed our innovation. We do this a lot with SPEP. We always work with their training units so that we can classify SPEP training or the SPEP boosters so that it meets the criteria for staff, any staff annual professional development training requirements, those kinds of things. The going down to meeting physical space needs and purchasing equipment and technology. We actually had one site that we didn't realize it held up our implementation significantly because they didn't have the PCs that were sufficient enough to maintain data collection, which was at the time in Excel. So these are things that I have learned now to look into and to anticipate. And in terms of implementation stages, this is really just breaking things down in terms of the idea of initial and full implementation. With initial implementation, you need to be proactive, set it up so that you're getting quick feedback loops. We want to reduce leader and staff frustration. We also need, however, to, at this time, to get the process challenges and the kinks out so that we can do a full implementation. And then with full implementation, and I mentioned that 2 to 4 year gap there in terms of all the stages, the time it takes to go from pilot to full does vary greatly for all innovations, right? So if any of these hiccups, like the not having PCs, should appear, it's really going to impact your timeline. But following these stages and thinking about these stages in a proactive manner is really doable. And it helps you anticipate and plan for the stages and the component issues. I'm going to skip through here. There's implementation drivers, which are 3 key things. Again, this is handy framework from Fixin and Blaze, looking at competencies and organization and leadership. The takeaway here primarily should be that there's multiple drivers that will get you your desired outcome. They're not separate drivers, though. They're all interconnected, interdependent, and equally important for fidelity and sustainability. For example, in terms of competencies, there's coaching, training, and selection. I actually used these terms to develop my training and implementation tools in each of those areas. So for that bottom one, say selection, we have a pre-implementation strategy where responsibilities and requirements are given to and folks who make selections in terms of who's going to implement are given the appropriate information. We like to do site-based selection for specialists and trainers. In terms of training, I vastly changed my training when I started understanding more about implementation science. It's multi-tiered. There's classroom, there's shadowing, there's booster and peer-to-peer via learning communities. In terms of coaching, we've moved peer-to-peer via learning community across the globe. What we've done is just this summer started a training quarterly call where all the trainers for SPEP get together. They present things, they brag on themselves, and I also am able to give updates on our tools. Finally, here's implementation teams, which has been incredibly key. The main takeaway here is that for best results, you need to create implementation teams from stakeholders at your target sites. You know, I didn't do this originally, but it's been so valuable. Matter of fact, my most recent implementation site actually not just had their implementation team pulled together, but they created a charter with responsibilities and goals. I'm interested to see how that changes or how that impacts their commitment. But I should also mention this isn't just for the beginning in terms of implementation. I turn the implementation teams, at least for SPEP, I turn them into the advisory boards or advisory teams for SPEP as it moves out of the implementation stage. And I'm going to move on to some friendly, user-friendly resources. We've got a bunch of stuff up here. I'm sure the slides will be available and you can use it. This implementation research synthesis of literature down at the bottom left corner is the document I talked about. It is the 2005 tome of all things implementation research, incredibly user-friendly and available free and online, by the way. The implementation practice and science text that's up there, and it is by Fixon, Blaze, and Van Dyke, published just recently in 2019, and it presents the stuff in the synthesis, but also adds the next 15 years of additional research frameworks and tool development. I have 3 sites here, the National Implementation Research Network, as well as the Global Implementation Society, and then finally, my little plug for the Global Implementation Conference. We've got that coming up in May. This is what I was talking about early on when I said I found my people. This is where I found them. To take a look at those, they have an amazing amount of resources, course materials even, online, and easily available, all free, amazingly enough. And thank you so much. Please, if you have, email me if you have any questions or interest in that process or my center in general. And I'll turn it over. And it looks like I've got 2 questions. Mark, should I take these, or we're at time, so I'm not sure?
Yeah, I want to first thank you, Gabrielle. We do have some time for the questions. And if you're able to view those, why don't you go ahead and take them? And before you do that, though, I just want to announce that as we're going into this Q&A portion of the webinar, we're also going to open a poll to get your reactions to today's program. So please take a minute to provide feedback before you sign off. Your input really helps us fulfill our reporting requirement. So thank you for that. Go ahead, Gabrielle. You're able to see the questions?
I am in just a second. I can see the poll. Oh, there it is. Cool. Thank you. That's my favorite visual, the one with the playset. Someone commented on it. The playset on top of the building. I use that all the time. I think it really speaks to the issue of implementation science, but I've used in other contexts as well. Oh, Brian Bumbarger had a question here. For the characteristics of the intervention, program, practice, strategy, also have an impact on implementation and outcomes? Yes. If it's poorly defined, has a vague logic model, oh gosh, yes, has weak evaluation research evidence. All of these make implementation more difficult and outcomes less likely. It's not a doesn't look like it's a question, but it's an incredibly wise statement, and thank you for making that. Just exactly the characteristics of the intervention have an impact on implementation and therefore outcomes. That's absolutely true. We know this through our meta-analytic database as well. Program type has and how it's delivered, quality, quantity, how much the kids need to get or actually get, and the risk level of the kiddos are our biggest predictors for how well the kid is going to receive the information, the treatment, and whether it's going to implement or make some differences in terms of recidivism reduction. We've got another question, dog program. I always get dog program questions. Makes me want to ask, how do you know which EBP program a JJ should try to implement? What a program is shiny, good feeling sounds like these are not good criteria for a program indeed. What are their criteria for selecting the right evidence-based program? Actually, if you go on, there's some really nice tools in terms of using that hexagon model or framework that I had up. That's actually available online, free, and it is very useful, I think. But also, there's some other tools there where you can actually kind of look at readiness, look at what kids you're really serving, what your goals are, and kind of chart that out in a very thoughtful, intentional way, and figure out what's the best match, or what evidence-based program is the best match. I can tell you through some of Mark's work, we know that certain programs on average can have better recidivism reduction capabilities. That said, I'm saying on average. So there are indeed programs that may just work for that one kid or that one group of kids. You've also got to think in terms of risk level. What risk level? You don't want to, fill the teacup with the fire hose and over-treat, because we know that'll actually make things worse. But there are some tools, and I would highly take advantage of them. And there's some other tools that aren't just the implementation science tools that we have put together, Mark and I, over the years, that we could absolutely share with you. If you email me, I'm happy to talk and consult about that. I live programming. We have time we've got a couple more here. I'm going to keep going unless somebody cuts me off. So, Andrew Coleman, how can juvenile justice systems apply IS, implementation science, to juvenile justice processing? The developing and implementing risk assessment instruments, facility policies, and procedures. There's ways of doing that. Mainly, a lot of times when you're looking at implementation science frameworks, you're really looking at a specific program, how it's being implemented, and whether you should implement it or not, what the levels of implementation are, what some of your key hiccups or problems will be, and things you need to be proactive about. That said, in terms of implementing risk assessment instruments, policies, and procedures, we pick that up from a SPEP perspective. We pick that up as part of our measure. So when we're part of our SPEP score. So when we're looking at a service, a specific service, and we're looking at how that service is being delivered, we're actually picking up on the quality, the quantity, and the risk level of the kiddo. And I'll tell you what we frequently find is, even if there is an evidence-based risk assessment that is being used in a site or in a state or in a large county, even by policy if it's being used, a lot of times it's not being, kids are not being reassessed on as frequently as you would like, as frequently as would be meaningful. What's going to happen are all these processing pieces are going to come up as you start zeroing in on the details of the program and the details of the particular service.
Gabrielle, you have time for one more question, and I see you have one there from Kathy Nestaby from Iowa. Do you see that?
One of my favorite people. Hey, Kathy from Iowa. How do you see SPEP fitting into the largest continuous quality improvement process structure in a JJ system? I think it fits in pretty well. What we need to do, it's that part of the customization, is to match. SPEP has its own quality need. It's one of the data needs, right? Again, we've got program type or service type. We have quantity, how much the kid's getting of that particular program type, and the risk level of the kiddo that's taking that specific program type. But we also require one of the other components and data pieces we need is the quality of that particular service type. And what we can do is amend, customize our quality needs based on what you already have in place. So in terms of if you've already got a continuous quality improvement, a CQI that's functional, I'm going to jump on that and leverage that to get at the quality data that we need for the quality component of the SPEP model. Additionally, I think in terms of the CQI, depending on how large or functional it is, a lot of times in a lot of states and sites, we actually, SPEP is actually housed within those units. So it literally fits into the quality improvement process because it becomes one of the tools or one of the instruments of that particular process or system.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank Dr. Chapman again, and I want to thank all of you for participating in the webinar. If you have more questions, you can see on this slide there's contact information for Dr. Chapman. And once again, don't forget to fill out the poll. And with that, that will conclude the webinar. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.